My name is Naomi Petrova. I am 33 years old. 2 years ago, I sat in a county planning office in Missoula, Montana. I was holding a clipboard my sister did not yet know belonged to me. She had spent 15 years telling our family that my job was playing with animals. She said I was not building a real career. She said it at Christmas. She said it at my college graduation, quietly, to our mother. She thought I could not hear her from across the room. She said it 3 weeks before this meeting, on the phone. She found out I still drove the same truck I had owned since graduate school. I did not argue with her that day. I never argued with her about it. I simply waited. On a gray Tuesday morning in March, my sister Katrina walked into that same planning office. She was there to fight for a permit her company needed. She did not know yet that the wildlife biologist was me. I was standing between her and $40 million of riverside development. Let me take you back to how I ended up holding that clipboard, how she ended up needing what was in my hands. I grew up in Missoula, in a small house on the north side of town. It was close enough to the Clark Fork River that I could hear it at night. My bedroom window only needed to be cracked open. The water ran low and steady in August. Every April it ran loud with snowmelt. Our neighborhood smelled like cut grass. In autumn it smelled like wood smoke drifting down from the mountainside above us. I have never fully found that smell anywhere else I have lived since. My father, Anatoly, came to Montana from outside Volgograd in the early 1980s. He worked most of his life as a machinist at a lumber mill on the edge of town. He came home most evenings with sawdust still caught in the creases of his knuckles. It was there no matter how hard he scrubbed. He kept his old work boots from that first winter in the garage for decades. He had them resoled twice and refused to throw them out. He told us once that they were the only proof he had left of how far he had actually come. My mother, Lydia, came over a few years after him. She cleaned houses for most of my childhood. Eventually, she managed the front office at a dental practice downtown. They were careful people, practical people. They were the kind of immigrants who believed deeply that stability was the only inheritance worth passing down. Katrina was born 6 years before me. By the time I came along, my parents had already decided what kind of children they were raising. They never said it out loud. Katrina was the one who was going to make something of the family name. I was the one who came along afterward. I was a smaller, quieter afterthought in a house that had already picked its favorite. My father used to tell a story about his first winter in Montana. He arrived in December with a single suitcase. He had no English beyond what he had memorized from a phrase book. He took a job at the mill. The foreman communicated mostly through gestures and patience. He told that story at almost every family gathering I can remember. Every time, it ended the same way. He would look at Katrina and say, with real pride in his voice, that she was proof. The sacrifice had been worth it. He never once turned to me at the end of that story. I do not think he was being cruel. I think, in his mind, the story simply did not have a chapter for me yet. He was still waiting to see which chapter I would write. Jonah heard that story for the first time at the one family gathering he attended. Afterward, in the car, he said something that stayed with me for a long time. He said it sounded less like a story about immigration. It sounded more like a story about which child got to be the proof. I had never heard it described quite that plainly before. Once he said it, I could not unhear it. It reframed almost every dinner I had ever sat through in that house. It took me years to understand that waiting itself was its own kind of verdict. I do not say that with bitterness, not anymore. It took me a long time to get here. Katrina was genuinely gifted in ways that were easy to see and easy to reward. She won a state debate championship in high school. She got a full scholarship to the University of Montana's business program. She interned at a Missoula real estate firm the summer after her sophomore year. She had a job offer waiting before she even graduated. Everything about her path looked like a straight, well-lit hallway. My path looked like a dirt trail through the woods. To my parents, that difference mattered more than either of us understood at the time. Katrina actively discouraged my interest whenever she had the chance. It was not out of malice exactly. It was out of what I now recognize as embarrassment on my behalf. She once told her high school friends that I would end up one of those weird bird lady types. She said it clearly within my earshot. She said nobody wants to sit next to them at parties. I was 11. I did not fully understand the insult at the time. I only knew that it made her friends laugh. It seemed to make Katrina feel, briefly, more secure in her own position at the center of the room. I loved animals before I loved almost anything else. I used to spend hours down by the river as a kid. I would catalog which birds showed up in which season. I kept a small spiral notebook I filled with sketches of osprey nests and heron tracks in the mud. My mother found that notebook once when I was around 10. She told me, not unkindly, that it was a nice hobby. She said I should focus on something with a future. I do not think she meant it cruelly. She had built a life from nothing in a new country. She genuinely believed that admiring wildlife was a luxury reserved for people who already had money. Katrina absorbed that same belief and turned it into something sharper. By high school, she had a habit of introducing me to her friends as her little sister who likes bugs. She said it in a tone that made it sound like an eccentricity rather than a direction. I remember a school science fair in 6th grade. I built a display on riparian bird populations along the Clark Fork. I included hand-drawn range maps and a small recorded tape of birdsong. I had captured the birdsong myself with a borrowed cassette recorder. I won second place in the regional competition. That was a genuinely rare result for our school district that year. My parents did not attend the awards ceremony. It conflicted with one of Katrina's debate tournaments 2 hours away in Helena. Debate tournaments came with trophies large enough to display in the living room. Science fairs did not. My teacher drove me home that evening instead. She told me, kindly, that she thought I had real scientific instincts. I believed her more than I believed almost anything my own parents told me about myself that year. I want to be precise about the shape of our house because it explains everything that came later. There were 2 kinds of attention available in our family. The first was celebration. It went almost entirely to Katrina, for grades, for scholarships, for promotions at the firm where she built her career. The second was tolerance. It was quiet and a little embarrassed. That was what I received for choosing a field nobody in my family understood or valued. I remember one specific dinner. It was the spring I got accepted into a graduate program in wildlife biology at the University of Montana. It was my own hometown school and a genuinely competitive program. Only a small cohort was admitted each year. My father asked, seriously, whether that meant I would eventually be a veterinarian. When I explained it was closer to field work and habitat research, he nodded slowly. He changed the subject to Katrina's new promotion at the firm. Nobody was cruel about it. That was almost the hardest part. Cruelty would have been easier to name than quiet disappointment. By then, I had my own quiet life taking shape alongside all of this. I met my partner, Jonah Rourke, at a public lecture on wolf reintroduction I gave for the department. He was a middle school science teacher. I turned 28 that year. Jonah was the rare person outside my field who asked genuine follow-up questions instead of polite ones. Within a year, we had built a small house together outside town. It was close enough to the rattlesnake wilderness that we could hike from our own backyard. Jonah came to exactly one family gathering with me. It was my parents' wedding anniversary, 2 years before the 40th. Afterward, in the car, he asked me carefully why nobody at the table had asked about my work all evening. I told him that was simply how it had always been. He did not say anything else about it that night, but I noticed after that how closely he started watching the pattern whenever we visited. Katrina got married when I was 26 to a man named Colin Ashwood. He was a commercial lender she met through her firm. Their wedding was a large, polished affair at a lodge outside Whitefish. 200 guests attended. A band was flown in from Seattle. I was a bridesmaid. At the reception, during her toast, Katrina thanked our parents for always believing in what she could become. She thanked Colin for understanding ambition. She did not mention me once in a 15-minute speech. I had spent 3 weekends helping her address 200 invitations by hand. She said my handwriting was neater than the calligrapher's quote justified paying for. I did not say anything about it at the time. I told myself it was her day. Keeping score at someone else's wedding is a small, ugly thing to do. Jonah and I married 2 years later in a small ceremony at a state park along the Rattlesnake. 40 guests attended. There was no band and no calligrapher. We had a potluck dinner afterward under string lights Jonah's brother had strung between 2 pine trees. My parents came. Katrina came alone since Colin was traveling for work that weekend. She gave a short, kind toast. It was the first time I can remember her speaking warmly about me in front of other people. It did not undo the 15-minute speech at her own wedding that never mentioned me, but I noticed it. I let myself feel the small warmth of it without needing it to be more than what it was. I have thought about that toast more times than I would like to admit in the years since. The escalation came in 3 distinct stages. Each one was heavier than the last. This is how things tend to build inside families, where one child's ambitions matter more than the others. The first stage came the year I finished my graduate degree. I took a permanent position with Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks. I worked primarily on population surveys for Canada lynx and grizzly bear habitat corridors in western Montana. By any objective measure, it was a real and difficult job. It required a graduate degree and extensive fieldwork certification. The level of technical expertise I had built took years to develop. At the family dinner celebrating the news, Katrina raised her glass. She had a small laugh that told everyone she meant it as a joke. She also meant every word of it. She said, well, someone has to play with the animals while the rest of us pay taxes. My mother laughed along. My father smiled into his plate. I smiled too. That is what you do in a family like mine. You smile at the joke that costs you something so nobody has to feel bad about having made it. Jonah, sitting beside me, went very still when Katrina said it. He told me later in the car that he had almost said something. He stopped himself only because he did not want to make the evening about him. I told him I appreciated the restraint. I had learned over many years that defending myself only ever made the room more uncomfortable for me, never for her. That was the first wrong. Dismissal, delivered as humor, at my own celebration. The second wrong came 3 years later. I was up for a competitive promotion to lead a multi-county carnivore monitoring program. At 30, it would have made me one of the youngest lead biologists in the department's western region. I mentioned it carefully at a family lunch. I was hoping for even a small acknowledgement. Katrina responded by pivoting the entire conversation to her own recent promotion to Senior Development Director at her firm. The role came with, she made sure to mention, a base salary of $185,000 before bonuses. She then asked me, in front of both our parents, what my starting salary had been at Fish and Wildlife. When I told her honestly it was $54,000, she made a small sound. It was somewhere between a laugh and a sigh. She said, "Well, at least you love it, right? Someone has to." I did get the promotion, eventually, a few months later. My new salary was $68,000 a year with expanded responsibilities across 4 counties. I remember driving home from that lunch with my hands tight on the wheel. I was replaying the exact tone of her voice when she said someone has to love it. It sounded as if loving the work was a consolation prize for not being paid what she was paid. I did not cry. I turned the radio up instead, loud enough to fill the truck. I did not turn it back down until I reached my own driveway. Nobody at that family lunch table ever asked me about the promotion again. That was the second wrong. Erasure delivered as concern. The third wrong came 2 years after that. It was the one that finally activated something long dormant in me. Our parents celebrated their 40th wedding anniversary at a banquet hall Katrina had rented and paid for almost entirely herself. During her toast, Katrina spoke for nearly 20 minutes. She talked about our parents' sacrifices, about the family's journey from Volgograd to Missoula. She talked about the values of hard work and ambition that had shaped both of us. She closed by saying she liked to think she had carried that forward the way her parents would have wanted. She did not mention me at all, not once, in a toast about our shared family history. She delivered it to nearly 100 guests, many of whom I had known my entire life. I called Harlan from the parking lot of that banquet hall before I had even reached my car. I sat in the driver's seat with the engine off and the cold seeping in through the door. He listened without interrupting, the way he always did. When I finished, he said only one thing. He said the people who build quietly rarely get thanked at the podium. He said the podium was never actually where the real proof lived anyway. I did not fully understand what he meant that night. I understood it completely 2 years later, standing at a different podium of my own. I sat at my table afterward, my untouched glass of champagne warm in my hand. I understood, finally, that my sister had decided I was a footnote in a story she considered entirely her own. That was the third wrong. Erasure at scale, delivered in public, in front of everyone who had ever known our family. I did not confront her that night. I did not confront her at all, actually, not in any dramatic sense. I drove home from that banquet hall in near silence. Somewhere on Highway 93, in the dark, I made a quiet decision. It was not about settling scores. It was about refusing to keep auditioning. I was done auditioning for a family that had already cast its lead. I stopped bringing up my work at family gatherings. I stopped hoping for the acknowledgement. I redirected all of that energy into the only place it had ever actually been welcomed: the work itself. For the next several years, I built a career almost entirely outside my family's field of vision. I earned additional certifications in endangered species survey protocols. I spent long stretches of every summer in the backcountry along the Clark Fork and Blackfoot River corridors. I was tracking lynx populations through snow tracking transects and remote camera arrays. I became, over time, one of a small handful of biologists in western Montana. I was certified to conduct formal Endangered Species Act Section 7 habitat assessments for private development projects. It was a specialized and fairly obscure corner of my field. Most people, including my own family, had never heard of it. The first 2 years at Fish and Wildlife were genuinely difficult, financially and otherwise. I shared a small rental with two roommates well into my late 20s. I drove a truck with almost 200,000 miles on it. I turned down more than one invitation to family events. I could not afford the gas money and did not want to explain why. There were entire winters I questioned whether I had chosen a field that would ever support an actual life. No one in my family was there to reassure me otherwise. No one in my family fully understood what I was building toward in the first place. I want to be honest about how invisible this period felt. I spent entire winters alone in a heated cabin near Sealy Lake. I reviewed camera trap data at 2 in the morning. No one in my family was aware that any of it was happening. No one knew it mattered. Those winters have a texture I still carry with me. Cold mornings when the only sound was a camera trap clicking somewhere in the dark. The sensation of perfect solitude that felt, at the time, uncomfortably close to irrelevance. I used to drive home on Friday evenings from the cabin and sit in my driveway for a few minutes. I sat there before going inside, not because I was tired. I needed to remember there was a house to come back to. Someone inside always asked what I had found out there. Jonah always asked. He asked even when he did not fully understand the answer. That was, I eventually realized, its own kind of love. It was enough to keep going through winters when nothing else felt like enough. The person who saw all of it, who made those years bearable, was a man named Harlan Bricks. Harlan had been a federal wildlife biologist for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service for almost 4 decades before he retired. He ran a small volunteer tracking program for teenagers. I joined at 14, after my mother found my notebook and told me to focus on something with a future. Harlan was the first adult who ever looked at my sketches and told me I had an observer's eye. He said observers were rarer and more valuable than people gave them credit for. I decided, definitively, that this would be my life's work on a specific afternoon at 17. Harlan let me hold a sedated lynx during a research capture. Her fur was coarser than I expected. Her breathing was slow and steady under my hands. A colleague recorded her weight and measurements. Harlan told me quietly that most people go their whole lives without ever touching something wild and irreplaceable. He said the ones who do owe it something in return. I have carried that sentence with me through every cold morning and every dismissive family dinner since. He mentored me all through college and graduate school. He reviewed my thesis chapters late into the night at his kitchen table. He eventually became the reference who got me my first interview at Fish and Wildlife and Parks. I remember one specific afternoon with him, the September I was 16. We spent nearly 6 hours lying flat on our stomachs on a ridge above the Blackfoot River. We were waiting for a confirmed lynx sighting to reappear on a game trail below us. My legs went numb. My notebook filled with nothing but weather notes and false alarms. Harlan never once suggested we give up and head back to the truck. Late in the afternoon, the lynx finally crossed. She was unhurried. She was close enough that I could see the black tufts on her ears catch the last of the light. Harlan did not say anything for a long moment afterward. Then he turned to me and said that most people would have quit around hour 2. He said patience like mine was not common. He said I should never let anyone convince me it was a small thing. I have thought about that ridge more times than I can count. Especially on the days my own family made the work feel small again. Harlan also taught me, that same year, how to sit with silence in the field without needing to fill it. That skill turned out to matter just as much in family kitchens as on a ridge line. It was equally useful waiting for an animal that might not appear at all. Harlan never had children of his own. He used to say, half joking, that he had accidentally collected a small flock of them anyway. They were biologists he had trained who now worked all over the western United States. He died 4 years ago of a stroke at 78. He died in that same small house outside Sealy Lake. That was where he had taught me to tell a lynx track from a bobcat's by the toes. I spoke at his funeral, alongside 11 other biologists he had mentored over the decades. It was held in a small community hall that smelled like coffee and cedar. I did not tell my family about the funeral in advance. None of them asked why I took the day off work. Harlan left me his old set of Zeiss binoculars, worn smooth at the edges. He also left a single handwritten note. It read, simply, "The ones who notice quietly are the ones who end up knowing the most." I keep those binoculars in my truck to this day. I have carried them into every survey I have conducted since. That included the 11 weeks I spent on the Alder Ridge parcel. My graduate thesis was completed the year I turned 27. It focused on lynx denning site selection across 3 river drainages in western Montana. It was based on 4 winters of snow tracking data I collected largely alone. I was often camping in a small canvas tent at 20 degrees below zero. The animals I needed to track were most active at first light. My committee chair called it one of the most rigorous field data sets he had reviewed in over a decade. I mentioned that comment to my mother once, hoping it might land differently than my usual updates. She said that was nice. Then she asked whether I had thought about applying to veterinary school instead. It seemed like a shame to spend all that time outdoors without a medical degree to show for it. I did not bring up my thesis again after that. During those quiet years, I built a professional reputation that traveled well beyond my own department. It never once traveled as far as my parents' dinner table. I was invited, twice, to present survey methodology at a regional wildlife conference in Boise. I was also invited once to consult on a similar habitat dispute in the Bitterroot Valley. A proposed resort had threatened a documented wolverine denning area. That Bitterroot case settled the way most of my work settled, quietly, through redesign rather than confrontation. It taught me something I would need 2 years later without knowing it yet. It taught me that developers rarely fight the science once it is presented cleanly in public. They fight the uncertainty around the science. Uncertainty is the one thing 11 weeks of rigorous fieldwork does not leave behind. I also spent 2 full seasons training a younger biologist named Anjali Rao. She was newly hired into the department. I taught her the same camera trap protocols Harlan had once taught me. I watched her notice, for the first time, a set of fresh tracks she had walked past twice without seeing. I remember feeling something close to what Harlan must have felt on that ridge above the Blackfoot. That was all those years earlier, watching my own face change. The work does not stop needing new people. That was true even when your own family never noticed, you becoming one of the people who mattered. The trigger came almost exactly 2 years ago. It arrived in the form of a permit application filed with Missoula County by a company called Alder Ridge Development. I did not, at first, connect it to my sister at all. Katrina had been promoted again by then to managing partner at her firm. Alder Ridge was, on paper, a joint venture between her firm and an out-of-state investment group. They were proposing a 340-unit riverside subdivision along a stretch of the Clark Fork corridor, roughly 11 miles outside town. Alder Ridge had been in planning for nearly 3 years by the time it reached my desk. It had been quietly assembled through a series of land purchases along the river corridor. Katrina's firm had negotiated those parcels one at a time, largely under the radar of local conservation groups. Those groups might have organized opposition earlier if they had understood the full scope of the project. By every account I later read, it was meant to be the signature achievement of Katrina's career. It was the project that would finally make her a named partner instead of simply a senior director. I only learned it was hers when the county assigned me to conduct the mandatory habitat assessment. I was the department's lead biologist for that watershed. The assessment was required before any permit could move forward. I remember sitting at my desk, reading the applicant name on the file. I felt something settle in my chest that was not quite satisfaction and not quite dread. It was simply recognition. The moment had arrived, and I had not engineered a single part of it. A typical day on that survey started before 5 in the morning. I was checking 6 remote camera stations spread across roughly 4 miles of rugged terrain. Most of it was accessible only on foot or by snowshoe, depending on the week. I would download data cards at each station, replace batteries, and note fresh tracks in the surrounding snow. I logged GPS coordinates for anything worth flagging. By April, the snow had turned to mud thick enough to pull a boot clean off. By June, I was working through morning heat thick with mosquitoes. I was logging denning activity by watching from a concealed, blind nearly 300 yards from a suspected den site. I was patient enough not to disturb the animal. She had no idea her habitat was at the center of a $40 million dispute. I spent the following 11 weeks conducting the most thorough survey of my career. The Alder Ridge parcel sat directly across a documented lynx travel corridor. It was one of only 4 confirmed connectivity routes between 2 isolated subpopulations in that part of the state. I had personally helped map it through nearly a decade of camera trap data. I walked the parcel boundary in April snow, in May mud, in June heat. I logged 14 separate confirmed lynx detections across 6 camera stations. I also documented evidence of denning activity within 400 meters of the proposed clubhouse site. I documented everything according to federal protocol. I cross-referenced against the same Endangered Species Act standards I had spent years becoming certified to apply. I did not once inflate a data point or shade a conclusion to fit an outcome. I did not need to. The habitat was exactly what it was, regardless of whose name sat on the permit application. The night I received it, I told Jonah about the assignment. We sat at our kitchen table with a beer I did not finish. He asked if I was going to tell Katrina ahead of time. He asked whether I should give her some kind of warning before the hearing. I told him no. This was not a confrontation I had engineered. Softening it in advance would turn an honest professional finding into something that looked personal. That was exactly the opposite of what I needed it to look like. He nodded slowly and told me he trusted my read on it. He said he would be in the back row on the day of the hearing if I wanted him there. I told him I did. The night before the hearing, I sat at our kitchen table until almost midnight. I was reviewing the report one final time, checking every camera station date against my field notebook. I was making sure nothing could be challenged on a technicality that had nothing to do with the actual science. Jonah found me there close to midnight and asked if I was nervous. I told him I was not nervous about the data. The data was simply true regardless of who needed it not to be. I told him I was nervous about the room. I was nervous about my parents potentially hearing about it secondhand before I had a chance to explain it myself. I was nervous about Katrina's face in the specific moment she realized. He sat with me for another 20 minutes without saying much. Eventually, he took the folder gently out of my hands and told me it was ready. He said I needed to sleep instead of rereading it a sixth time. He was right. I slept for maybe 4 hours that night. I woke up at 5 to walk the dog and drink 2 cups of coffee. Then I drove to the county building alone, the way I had decided I wanted to arrive. The public hearing was scheduled for a Tuesday morning in March. It was held in front of the full Missoula County Planning Board. The meeting room seated perhaps 60 people. That morning, the room was entirely full. Katrina arrived with 2 colleagues from her firm and an attorney. She was dressed in the kind of tailored navy suit she wore to every important meeting of her career. She did not look at me when she walked in. I do not think she had any reason to expect the department's lead biologist to be her own sister. Our professional lives had never once intersected in 15 years. I had stopped, long ago, mentioning my work at family gatherings where she might have connected the dots. The board chair called the habitat assessment portion of the hearing. He asked the assigned biologist to present findings. I stood, walked to the small podium at the front of the room. I set down a folder containing 11 weeks of documented survey data. I watched Katrina's face as I approached the podium. I watched the exact moment recognition crossed it. There was a small, involuntary widening of her eyes. She caught herself and arranged her expression into something more composed. I did not smile. I did not need to. I simply began speaking, plainly, about camera trap detections, about denning activity. I described the specific federal standards that applied to development within a documented threatened species corridor. I explained that the Alder Ridge parcel intersected a confirmed links connectivity corridor. Under Section 7, the proposed clubhouse and eastern residential cluster could not proceed without significant redesign. The alternative was a formal incidental take permit process. That process would likely add 18 months and substantial cost to the project. I presented the camera trap data, station by station, date by date. I did not raise my voice. I did not look at Katrina more than professional courtesy required. I was reciting findings. Findings do not need volume. Katrina's attorney asked several pointed questions. He was attempting to challenge the survey's methodology. He asked whether a single season of data could truly establish a confirmed corridor. I explained the data spanned nearly a decade, not a single season. It was cross-referenced against department records predating my own assignment to the watershed. He asked whether camera trap evidence could be considered conclusive without direct visual confirmation by a licensed biologist. I explained that I had personally conducted 17 site visits over the survey period. I had visually confirmed Link's presence on 4 separate occasions. Each one was logged and time-stamped in the report before the board. He had no further questions after that. I answered each question calmly, citing the specific federal protocols I had followed. These protocols were a matter of public record. They had been used to defend similar findings in 3 prior Montana development disputes. At one point, the board chair asked about any prior relationship between me and the applicant's development firm. I answered honestly. I said the lead partner on the project was my older sister. I explained that I had recused myself from any supervisory role in reviewing my own findings. I had submitted the full dataset instead for independent peer review by a second certified biologist in the department. Her signature also appeared on the final report. I heard a chair creak somewhere behind me. 2 board members exchanged a glance I could not fully read. The room went very quiet. Katrina's face, for the first time in the entire hearing, lost its composure entirely. She stared at me from across the room. For a moment, I watched my sister truly see me, professionally, for the first time in either of our lives. The board voted, that afternoon, to require a full redesign of the eastern residential cluster. They also required a 2-year monitoring plan before any construction could proceed near the identified corridor. This added an estimated $2.3 million in costs and delays to the project. The redesign process itself stretched across most of that following year. Katrina's firm brought in an outside conservation consultant at the board's insistence. The consultant was there to independently verify my findings before any revised plan could be approved. That consultant's report confirmed my data point for point. It also confirmed 2 additional denning sites my original survey had flagged as probable, but not yet fully confirmed. The final approved plan preserved a 420-acre buffer along the corridor as permanent open space. It was deeded to a regional land trust as a condition of the permit. That had never been part of the original proposal. Alder Ridge Development ultimately redesigned the site. They moved the clubhouse and 40 of the proposed units outside the corridor buffer entirely. The change added nearly 14 months to their timeline, but allowed the project to proceed. I want to be clear that I did not seek to destroy my sister's project. I sought only to tell the truth about a documented species corridor. The truth happened to be inconvenient for her. It often is for people who have never had to reckon with it before. Jonah picked me up outside the county building that evening. We drove out to a pullout above the river instead of going straight home. It was the same spot where he had once asked me why nobody asked about my work at dinner. We sat on the tailgate for a long time without talking. Eventually, he asked how it felt. I told him it did not feel like winning, exactly. It felt like finally being read correctly after 15 years of being read wrong. Those were not quite the same sensation, though people often assume they are. Katrina called me that night, 9 hours after the hearing ended. She did not apologize, not directly. She asked instead how long I had been doing this kind of work, this specific, specialized survey work. The tone of the question suggested the answer might explain away the discomfort of the day. I told her 8 years. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said something I did not expect. She said she had genuinely never known what my job actually involved beyond the word biologist. She admitted she had always pictured it as something closer to a hobby than a career. I told her that was, in some ways, exactly the problem. She did not have a response to that. We sat on the phone in silence for almost a full minute before she said she needed to go. Word of the hearing reached the rest of our extended family within days. That is how news like that always travels, faster than anyone actually intends. My cousin called first, then an aunt. Both were careful and curious. They asked whether it was true that I was the biologist who had stopped Katrina's big project. I told them the truth, plainly. I had not stopped anything. I had only reported what the land actually contained. My mother called 2 days later. For the first time in longer than I could remember, she asked me detailed questions about my job. She asked about the survey and what a lynx corridor actually was. She asked why it mattered enough to delay a project that size. I answered every question. I did not need to make a point of it. The questions themselves were the point. It took the better part of a year for anything between us to shift meaningfully. Katrina came to my department's regional office that following autumn, unannounced. She asked if I would walk her through the actual survey methodology. It was not for the project, which was already redesigned and moving forward. She said she wanted to understand what my work actually was. I spent 2 hours walking her through camera trap placement, snow tracking protocols, and the federal review process. I showed her actual field photographs from the corridor. Among them were 2 confirmed images of a lynx and her kittens. They were moving through the exact area where her clubhouse had originally been designed to sit. She was quiet for a long time looking at those photographs. She asked if she could keep a printed copy. I gave her one. Our relationship now is not what either of us would call close, not yet. I am honest with myself about that. But she has, twice now, referred colleagues at other firms to my department for early-stage habitat consultations. She never once did that in 15 years of working adjacent to these kinds of projects. She had never thought to ask about wildlife corridors before. She has not, to my knowledge, told anyone in the family that my starting salary was $54,000. She has, for the first time I can remember, introduced me to a colleague as my sister, the wildlife biologist. There was no laugh attached to the sentence. Our parents have said little about any of it directly. A few months after the hearing, my mother asked whether I still had that old spiral notebook from the river, the one with the heron sketches. I told her I did. She asked if she could see it sometime. I have not shown it to her yet. I am not in a hurry. Some doors open slowly. I have decided I am allowed to be the one who sets the pace on this particular one. I have thought a great deal, since that hearing, about what actually drove Katrina all those years. I do not believe she dismissed my work out of simple cruelty. I think she was afraid, in a way she likely never named even to herself. She feared being the only one in the family who had to justify her own choices. It was easier to place me permanently below her. She could not risk being measured against a sister who had built something equally serious. My work was just quieter and harder to see from a distance. Our parents built their entire sense of having succeeded in this country around Katrina's visible achievements. I think Katrina understood, on some level, that my work counting as real would change things. The family's whole story about what success looked like would have to expand. It would have to include a version neither of them had planned for. I do not think she ever sat down and reasoned through it this clearly in her own mind. I think it operated more like a reflex, the way an old habit does. It was something she reached for without examining it. The same way I used to smile automatically at a joke that cost me something. I did it rather than risk making a room uncomfortable. Fear rarely announces itself honestly in families. It usually shows up wearing a joke or a raised glass at somebody else's expense. Sometimes it shows up as a 15-minute toast that simply forgets a sibling exists. In the years since, I have tried to extend Katrina the same grace I eventually extended my parents. I did that without pretending the years of dismissal did not genuinely happen, without asking myself to forget how long they lasted. I have thought often, since that hearing, about small moments from years earlier I never quite understood at the time. I remember Katrina asking me once offhand at a family barbecue whether all that camera trap stuff was actually accurate. She asked whether biologists just guessed based on tracks in the mud. The question felt dismissive in the moment. I now recognize it as her one genuine attempt to understand what I actually did all day. It was clumsy, but it was real. I remember my father mentioning something the week before the anniversary banquet. Katrina had asked him what kind of degree the wildlife thing required. He had waved it off as small talk at the time. In the months following the hearing, Katrina's shift did not happen all at once. It happened in small increments, the way real change usually does. First, she stopped making the joke about playing with animals entirely. She stopped cold without ever announcing that she had stopped. Then she started asking, occasionally, genuine questions. She asked about camera trap batteries. She asked how cold it actually got out there in January. She asked whether I was ever afraid working alone in bare country. I answered honestly every time. Gradually, I noticed she was actually listening to the answers. She was no longer waiting for her turn to talk about her own week. I do not think either of those moments meant she secretly respected my work all along. I think they meant something more ordinary. Curiosity and dismissal can live in the same person at the same time. It often takes an inconvenient truth, delivered at a podium, to force the curiosity to finally win. I think, too, about what it means to be the second child in a family like mine. The second child in an immigrant family that arrived with almost nothing. My parents built their entire identity around proving the move had been worth it. Katrina delivered on that hope in a language the whole extended family could read at a glance. Degrees, salaries, a wedding at a lodge outside Whitefish. My success took the shape of patience and fieldwork and federal certifications nobody in my family had ever heard of. For a long time, an unfamiliar shape read as no shape at all. I do not resent my parents for needing that story. I understand, more now than I once did, how much fear sat underneath their hope. I simply wish that fear had left more room for the daughter who succeeded quietly. I succeeded on a timeline nobody else could immediately recognize. When I sit back and think about all of this now, here is what stands out to me most. I was promoted again last year to Regional Carnivore Program Coordinator. I now oversee survey work across 6 counties. I lead a small team that includes Anjali full-time. My salary now sits close to Katrina's own starting figure from years ago. I no longer keep track of the comparison the way I once quietly did at every family lunch. What I keep track of instead is the corridor itself, still intact, still crossed by lynx every winter. That fact will remain true long after any argument about whose career mattered more has been forgotten by everyone involved. Being underestimated is not the same as being unseen by everyone. For 15 years, I told myself my family's opinion of my work was the only opinion that mattered. I told myself its absence meant something was lacking in the work itself. Harlan Bricks saw exactly what I was building the entire time. His seeing it was enough to carry me through years my own family never noticed. I think about how easy it is to let the wrong audience decide whether your work has value. Quiet competence does not need an audience to keep growing. I spent 8 years building expertise nobody in my family understood or asked about. None of that time was wasted, even though it felt, some winters, like shouting into snow. The certification, the fieldwork, the 11 weeks of survey data. All of it existed and mattered long before anyone needed it to. A joke repeated enough times stops being a joke and becomes the shape of a relationship. Katrina's line about playing with animals started, I believe, as genuine affection dressed up as teasing. We were both children then, and neither of us understood what either of our lives would eventually become. By the time it had been repeated for 15 years, it had calcified into something closer to a verdict. It had traveled across a graduation, a promotion, a lunch table, and finally an anniversary banquet. She delivered it without ever noticing how much weight it had accumulated with every repetition. I think about how often families let a single old joke stand in for genuine questions. They never ask what someone actually does all day. How rarely anyone stops to check whether the joke is still funny to the person it is aimed at. You do not need the whole room to see you clearly, only the right few people, at the right moments. Jonah saw it. Harlan saw it, long before Jonah ever came into the picture. My family did not for most of my life. I spent years assuming that was a verdict on the work itself. It was simply a fact about who happened to be standing in that particular room. I have learned to stop confusing the two. Recognition that arrives through necessity is still recognition, even if it is not the kind you originally wanted. I did not want my sister to take my work seriously because a habitat survey cost her $2 million. That was not the recognition I wanted. I would have preferred she simply asked, years earlier, out of curiosity rather than consequence. But I have learned to accept the version that actually arrived. The alternative was waiting indefinitely for a version that may never have come at all. If you are the person in your family who has been quietly building something nobody else understands, hear this. The work was never actually small. It was only ever unseen by the people who happened to be standing closest to you. I hope, too, that you do not need a $40 million hearing to force the seeing. I hope it arrives for you gently, the way it eventually did for Katrina. I hope it comes in a quiet morning with a niece and a set of deer tracks. Not in a room full of strangers watching someone's composure break. But if it has to arrive that way, I hope you are ready. I hope you are as ready as 11 weeks of careful, patient fieldwork can make a person. I was. That readiness, in the end, was the only inheritance I ever actually needed. Katrina's daughter, my niece Mila, is 8 now. Last summer she asked me, unprompted, if she could come with me on a real survey day sometime. She had seen a photograph of a lynx kitten on my phone at a family barbecue. Katrina, standing beside her, said let her go, she should see what her aunt actually does. There was not a trace of a joke in her voice. I took Mila out for a short, easy morning near the rattlesnake trailhead a few weeks later. She found a set of fresh deer tracks entirely on her own. She asked me 4 separate questions about how old they were and which direction the deer had been moving. Near the end of that morning, she asked whether I had always known I wanted to do this work. I told her honestly that most people took a long time to believe I had chosen this work on purpose. They assumed I had simply failed to choose something more sensible. She thought about that for a moment, the way children sometimes do. She weighed the sentence far more carefully than adults expect. Then she said that seemed like a strange thing for grown-ups to get wrong about someone. I did not disagree with her. I gave her one of my old spiral notebooks to keep. I do not know yet what she will become. I know that for one full morning, she was taken seriously about something she noticed quietly. I intend to keep making sure that happens for her more than it happened for me. If this story meant something to you, I want to hear about it. Drop a comment and tell me about the Harlan in your life. Tell me about the person who saw what you were building before anyone else bothered to look. Type survey if you know exactly what it feels like to finally be taken seriously for the wrong reason.